Hello again, this is Mike with Toy Train Tips and Tricks. And in the world of Lionel, in the post-war period, with the exception of the short-lived and ill-fated Scout coupler, all Lionel couplers of the post-war period were all compatible with one another. They were all different versions of the same knuckle coupler. But Marx was a little different. In the post-war period, there were in fact 4 different couplers that were used by Marx, and at any given time, up to 3 of them could be in production at once. So keeping track of the different types of Marx couplers and which ones are compatible with which becomes somewhat of a challenge in the post-war period for Marx. And this is one of the things that makes dating Marx cars and locomotives more difficult than Lionel, because there's overlap in the types of things being used, and you even get things such as this car features much less detail than this car, but yet it has the better couplers than this car. So, Marx, it's hard to keep track of that way. So let's take a look at the different types of couplers and how they are compatible or incompatible with one another. So let's start with the tab and slot. And it gets its name because it has a tab and a slot. And this coupler originated in the pre-war period, 1936, and it was still in production all the way up to the end of Marx production in 1974. It is an outgrowth of the original pre-war Joyline coupler, which was also kind of a tab and slot, although the slot was more of a donut hole, much more round than this. And so this was used on, for example, tin 4-wheel cars, and later on it was used for tender drawbars and couplers on the rear of like E7s and other diesels that weren't intended to be coupled to any cars, but only to locomotives. But in any case, it stayed around. So this is the tab and slot coupler from 1936 to 1974. There are some slight variations, but this is the basic tab and slot coupler. Which brings us to the fork coupler. Now, the fork couplers first were made out of metal. This was made out of plastic. The fork coupler, or sometimes called the tilt coupler, because they tilt from side to side to uncouple. And it's actually quite an ingenious mechanism. With the spring here, on the bottom side of the coupler is this little piece here. So if you hit it one way, it'll slide out, but if you hit it the other way, it stays coupled. So these came with a special uncoupling section, which looks a little bit like this, although there are parts missing. What would also be here would be another bar, like a rail, and a spring attached to it. And normally this would be in the up position, but the spring, it could go side to side. And what would happen is when the car approaches and it hits that rail, if it's going this direction, it hits the rail, the coupler isn't going anywhere, but the rail has a spring on it, and so it bounces out of the way, and the car remains coupled. But coming the other direction, the rail hits, and the rail is now in its locked position, but the coupler can slide out of the way, and you see it tilts, uncoupling it from the coupler next to it. And so these came in both metal and plastic. The metal ones began in 1941. 1953 or so, they started switching to the plastic. And the other main difference between the metal and plastic is that the metal fork couplers do not have this slot. You will sometimes find them where someone has cut a slot in them, because the advantage of that slot is that it will mate with a tab and slot coupler. Without that slot there, obviously it will not. So these are compatible, the tab and slot and the plastic tilt coupler. These in good condition are becoming more and more difficult to find. As I checked on eBay, I found that many of them were in this condition with parts missing, or especially with the spring missing. So if you are going to purchase one of these on eBay, make sure you take a close look and make sure not only is that crosspiece there, but also that silver spring. Without that spring, the uncoupler will not work properly. Next, we have the next cheapest, and this is the plastic knuckle coupler. This is a non-operating coupler, and so it looks somewhat more realistic because of the knuckle coupler shape, but it is non-operating, non-functioning, and these were made from 1950 to 1974, so again, through the end of production. And you can see these on 8-wheel cars like this, you see them on 4-wheel plastic cars, you see them on some of the tin cars, and so a lot of it had to do with the quality or the price point of the particular set that Marx was making. Those that were higher price points, higher quality, would have the more expensive operating couplers, whereas others would have the non-operating knuckle coupler. Now, the knuckle coupler and the tilt coupler are incompatible, whether it's plastic or metal. But the tab and slot fits nicely in that knuckle. So these two are. So the tab and slot is compatible with both the knuckle coupler and the plastic tilt coupler. But the tab and slot is not compatible with the metal tilt coupler. Okay, so to recap, tab and slot will mate with plastic fork, will mate with knuckle. This one is almost universal. Knuckle will mate with tab and slot, but not plastic or metal fork. Fork coupler, plastic, will mate with tab and slot, not with knuckle, but it will mate with the metal tab or metal tilt. Metal tilt will only mate with plastic tilt. None of these designs will directly mate with the standard Lionel knuckle coupler. However, there are some things to do to make them compatible. One, of course, would be to just swap out the trucks, the Lionel for the Marx. But the problem with that is that Lionel trucks tend to be taller than the Marx, and so you get a difference in height. Another option is to take one of these early post-war bar end type trucks, and if you take this metal plate off that attaches here and attaches to the coupler, the wheelbase on these is the same as the Marx. So if you have a scrapped one of these Lionel cars, pull this off, attach it here, and you have a Lionel coupler on your Marx car. And lastly, if you don't want to modify the car in any way, then there is my handy-dandy coupler adapter. And click on the top here, and you can see a video on how I did these. This is actually an earlier version. The latest version, these little ears come down even farther to grip onto the Lionel coupler even better. But basically, that slides onto there. That goes into the slot, or into the slot, or into the slot. So with this adapter, the Lionel couplers are compatible with all three designs, just not the metal tilt coupler. And when you're done, you just slide it back off, and so you've made no modification to the car itself. And I printed this in this nice bright color to make it easy to find. The first batch I made up was in black, and they kind of disappeared into the layout. So again, as I mentioned before, for pre-war couplers, the most common type was the Joy line, which was similar to the tab and slot, except for instead of a slot, it was more of a big round hole, big donut hole, and then these came along in 1936. The other pre-war Marx coupler is called the one-way coupler. It was introduced in 1937, and it's called one-way because you can only run the cars one way. On one end of the car is a big spring-loaded claw, is probably the best way to describe it, and on the other end is a post. And through this very complicated mechanism, the spring-loaded claw will wrap around the post or connect or disconnect through an automatic system. It's very complicated. It was very expensive to produce, and that made it very allergic for the Marx Company, who's known for reliability and being cheap. These were very complicated, hard to work on, and very expensive to produce. So that's why, after the war, the tilt coupler came about to give the automatic coupling. All right, so let's put together a train using a mismatch of all of these different couplers and see what we can come up with. Okay, here's the train we've put together. I've got our Marx 666 steamer 242 with the New York Central tender with the plastic tilt coupler. We have an NYC 4-wheel tender with the tab and slot in the front and a plastic knuckle coupler in the back. We have a B&O boxcar with plastic knuckle couplers on either side. We have another NYC tender with the plastic coupler towards the boxcar and a tab and slot going into the crane car with the plastic tilt coupler, going into the boxcar and caboose with plastic tilt couplers. So using 3 different styles of Marx couplers all on one train. And let's give it a spin.